Although at pumps, firsthand, I've seen a little sticker of Joe Biden that says, "I did that," pointing to the price. I don't think that's good evidence or sound reporting. So today we are going to talk about some important topics related to news consumption and opinion, shared opinion, and specifically talking about echo chambers, which are these sort of group phenomena where you say the same thing that I'm saying, where I begin to embellish on that. It's resonant. A few more people that are like-minded get into the group, and all of a sudden we're reaching consensus about what the facts on the ground are. That's just a group reasoning phenomenon, which can be very helpful. But in the context of politics, where you're dealing with very complex information that's not been witnessed firsthand, you can go toward polarization really easily when you have an echo chamber. And we'll also talk about the danger of filter bubbles or news filter bubbles, which are instances in which your news feed begins to selectively edit, and only deliver you content that already fits with the content you've been viewing. And if you started in any way toward slanted content or propaganda-based content, sensationalistic content, you're only going to get more and more of that until you begin to actually become encased within a metaphorical bubble where only that sort of echo chamber consonant kind of information gets through and everything else is edited out.
Yeah, I think it's clear up front why these two concepts would be introduced together in the same episode. They're so tightly related to one another. See, I think it's appropriate to think of the filter bubble as referring to the information that we're exposed to, especially in online spaces, when we're navigating in an online world where we're able to curate our own content, sometimes unwittingly, due to the algorithms that help to feed us an endless supply of information. And that information tends to be consonant with what we've seen before. So if there are certain claims made about policy positions, highly editorialized spin on information, or the way in which certain political candidates are portrayed, we'll see more and more of that content, which gives this appearance of that being the only possible view on that topic. And the echo chamber element of this refers to the chatter around that information that's being filtered into us by those like ourselves who most likely share our opinions and give us this sense that there is unanimity and a point of view and a certain narrative that we're subscribing to weave together a way of making sense of the political worlds around us. So when we do happen to encounter somebody who doesn't see things the way we do, we can't even understand how it is that they can come to a different point of view, because I think maybe tacitly we assume that they're seeing the same things we're seeing. So they think, well, how is it that you're seeing the same claims, the same content, and come to a completely different conclusion from us? So I think the real danger is not just on the way in which it can give us this outsized confidence in our assertions and our beliefs, but the effect it has, the detrimental effect it has on our capacity to be able to interact in a productive way in conversation with those who don't share our point of view.
And this strikes me as a particularly modern problem. So if we think of our brains as having evolved for a hunter-gatherer tribal past, a lot of times opinion would be curated by the group, and there would only need to be a few group members who agreed, yes, there are rain clouds on the horizon. If you hear that a few times, there's pretty good social evidence to say, yeah, we probably should prepare for rain. Over time, as we become a larger society, journalism, fortunately in a free press, we've always had the benefit of multiple sources. It's just that in, say, the 1980s, for example, you would have had a lot of viewing of NBC, ABC, your local news, and a lot of it would have come from physical newspapers. Journalism was different then. And there were certainly biased sources then, as there are now, but there are just many, many more biased sources and much more opinion news and sensationalism. And that's just come about through first cable news and then the internet and social media. So it's important to notice that this is a particularly pernicious phenomenon now, because you are literally being profiled, not only by other people and political strategists, but by algorithms. So whatever you tend to click on and select, the algorithms are going to deliver more of that same thing. So it can become a very large snowball effect that all starts with heavily slanted opinion news, the consumption of it, and then the amplification of that through both algorithms and like-minded individuals. And that can also be an online phenomenon. You can find yourself in online echo chambers where more extreme polarized people are fueling what you've already started to come to believe about the world. So that is the essence of the problem. And we'll try to also talk about some of the research and also some of the solutions.
Yeah, the signal boosting effect of claims is something we definitely need to take into consideration. It's a phenomenon we experience because of the incredible advancements in technology that we use to transmit information and establish social networks that are vastly different than the evolutionary context in which shaped the behavior and the cognition of our species. It's true. I like this analogy you bring up when you imagine, let's say, in some primordial past, if some group of tribes members said, look, there's definitely a storm on the horizon, you could see there's a sort of perceptual trace to the original source. And that original source was someone who had some sort of physical contact with the phenomenon that they're reporting on. And journalism, ideally, takes on that form. For instance, we think about the journalists that we admire the most in this bygone era of like Hunter S. Thompson, gonzo journalists. What they were known for is they would completely immerse themselves into the world in which they're reporting, right? So is this not just a breadth of content and the efficiency, the acceleration and velocity with which they're able to get claims out, it was the depth of the content, right? The depth of analysis. And maybe it was very slow going, this very slow ruminating process of being able to report on some issue. But the point was, it was very richly layered. And it was from that perceptual trace, someone who's actually a part of that world they're reporting on. But most of what we're hearing now is secondhand, thirdhand, fourthhand information that's really just been passed down. And as far as who's actually physically there on the ground to see the event, well, who knows? And we're less concerned about that anyway.
Right, and in worst cases, it can actually be fabricated events that are completely detached from reality. It's complete hearsay or just sinister misinformation. So I had read an article about the features of fake news recently, and fake news compared to real news, whether it be CNN, Fox News,
more mainstream outlets
of real sources, yes, whether they be somewhat biased sources or more centrist sources, comparing those sources to actual fake news. Some of the key differences were the fake articles would have longer titles, and those titles would be very inflammatory, very emotionally provocative. And then the substance of the fake news article would be a lot of repetition of the headline. So it's kind of like this inflammatory gotcha headline that basically is the gist of the entire fake news article. And then there's really no substance to it. It's just literally junk food for your mind. It's packs a big punch, tastes really sweet for just a moment, and then quickly begins to corrode one's mind about what's actually happening in the events of the world. So the alternatives, the actual news sources, were going to have shorter titles that were less catchy. I mean, certainly journalism is going to want to catch your attention, but then there would be obviously more substance. There'd be longer articles. They would have, many more angles of inquiry. So notice the features there is just to your point about slowing down and sort of taking in the information at a more refined pace, maybe a slower pace that allows one to really reason through evidence. It's a different exercise than you see in fake news or propaganda. And unfortunately, it's that big sugary punch that tends to draw people in. And then the real risk is they end up being caught in a filter bubble that they're not even aware of, to the point where you get something like the Pizzagate phenomenon, where someone's actually acting in an attempt to rescue these supposed victims, and then only after he's on the scene does he discover, oh, that actually wasn't the case. And so these are really sinister problems of today's media environment that people can get caught particularly when its news is not coupled to evidence and is inflammatory. It's almost like flypaper, that sort of draws you and entraps you. And so that's really the phenomenon of the filter bubble.
Yeah, I think this also highlights the different strategies or philosophies we may embrace as far as what to do as a mitigation effort against this phenomenon. So there's more like this top-down approach. I guess use as an analogy here. Let's think about how just as there is just a deluge of information out there which misinforms, which isn't very, let's say, nutritious, as it were, right? I think we oftentimes hear public health announcements about issues with processed food and how that's bad for our bodies. And the more top-down approach is, well, let's just make sure that manufacturers are not permitted to make foods that are bad for the public. That's one approach. And for the most part, it doesn't seem to be all that effective. There are all sorts of ways in which manufacturers try to get around limitations, but it seems to me like maybe the better approach is more bottom-up, where you start with informing consumers, letting them know what is actually happening to them. Like I remember when I was much younger, learning for the first time that there are certain foods out there that are such a super stimulus for what's appealing to the human, to our taste buds. Like who can eat just one Oreo, right? You're going to eat the whole box. We all have to admit that. It's shameful, but we all do it because it's a super stimulus. It's designed for that, and there's a reason why misinformation sticks the way it does, because it's a super stimulus. It's got all the hallmarks of what we're looking for. It's got a scintillating story. It's got heroes and villains. It's got all the makings of a blockbuster film that we all go out to see.
It's about escaping threat.
Yes, the basic narratives of, man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself. That falls into one of these categories, right? And that's sort of the dopaminergic sweet spot for what really captures our attention. So if we understand that, we can see why it is that this content has the effect it has on us, as opposed to saying, well, for whatever reason, I just get the sense that this is true. I get the sense that this is the real reporting. You can say, oh, there's a reason why it has that effect on you, because it's been manufactured, it's been shaped to have that effect. There's a whole line of research highlighting this repetition phenomenon that you mentioned earlier. Like Tania Lombrozo has a line of research on the stickiness, as it were, of fake news claims. And she looks into the psychology of what happens when we read a claim that's repeated over and over again. In some of her studies, participants were asked to read a series of articles where there'd be claims made which the participants knew the first time they saw those claims were false, and they were confident that they were false. But upon reading subsequent passages in which the same claim would appear again and again and again, those confidence levels started diminishing. They thought, I still think it's false, but I'm less sure now of that. And eventually they flip entirely the other direction. Now they're thinking, maybe those claims are true after all. This is similar to, I think, what happens in that sort of runaway effect if somebody gets trapped in that world of a filter bubble with an algorithm that's feeding them the same content, the same kind of narrative over and over again. Eventually get to that point where your mind's defenses start to wear down. And I think that's one way of understanding why this is as rampant as it is, and such a stubborn problem.
Right, and this is a feature of the brain. This is one of the major features of the brain. It was known as the mere exposure effect in the 1960s. Robert Zients did a lot of this work where he would expose people to tones or unfamiliar Chinese characters that they had not seen, and then later on expose them to new characters and the other ones, just have them rate preference. They would prefer the ones that had been exposed earlier. And one of the explanations was fluency, as you mentioned. So when information hits the brain and we find it highly fluent, we can process it easily. It already fits with our worldview. It's just more evidence, and it easily passes through the filter. It's almost as if the prior times that the information hit, it made some kind of information-shaped impact on our brain, and now the same kind of thing can fit through that permeability zone and enter, whereas discrepant information we become hardened against it. It's highly non-fluent, we say, well, how could that be? Because I already came to believe this other thing about the world. So we become naturally resistant to the counter information. So this is, of course, fueling confirmation bias as well. And to point out one of the remedies, so I think of Frank Keil's work. Keil has done a lot of his research on confidence and reasoning about different everyday mechanisms. And one of the ones that comes to mind, he had an experiment on this illusion of explanatory depth, is what he calls this phenomenon. He would bring participants into a lab and have them evaluate how well they understood something like a jet engine. And they would give a rating, let's say, I understood probably a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. I've seen the turbines spin. I've heard jets. I've seen them take off. I can even, imagine the smell of jet fuel. I'm very familiar with those. And then he would ask them, well, how does it work? And they would have to mechanistically try to describe how exactly a jet engine enables an airplane to fly. And they found they were giving these very hand-wavy explanations of the turbine spins and somehow moves forward. And by interrogating it that way, they realized they were mistaking familiarity and fluency, perceptual fluency with the jet engine, with an actual mechanistic knowledge of it. And I think that same thing can happen in our political news, where, understanding healthcare, gun control, abortion, states' rights, whatever it is, these are big, complex issues that many lawyers and policymakers have to debate almost endlessly to craft. And so we shouldn't expect easy answers. We should not mistake our familiarity with hearing about healthcare with believing we actually understand it at the granular policy level. And so I think there's a lesson there, is to hit, one way to pump the brakes is just to say, well, what do I actually know about healthcare? Like my own healthcare, like how does my insurance cover a variety of things? That's a more tractable problem than trying to understand the national healthcare debate. And so you can sort of work your way up to that national complex policy level by understanding sort of mechanistic facts. But make sure you keep your confidence in check. That's the key. Always question your assumptions.
Yeah, I think that this actually highlights a practical tactic to use in real time in a conversation over a complex issue, whether it be related to healthcare or the economy or some sort of international treaty or national affairs, right? Is to remind ourselves that it's best to remain curious and exploratory about an issue that's incredibly complex, and most likely we're both beginners on the topic, right? So it's sort of an invitation for both of us to try to explore from the ground up how to make sense of the issue. And I think about most things that aren't involved in politics, we do this automatically. Like say, Dan and I were cognitive neuroscientists, and so we might have our opinions on various debates with respect to how cognitive architecture it maps onto different neural structures and so on, right? Because we know about these topics and we published on them. But imagine if we just happened to come across a debate on string theory or some kind of issue in quantum mechanics. I mean, it would be strange enough to say, well, I have this hardened opinion and I'm never to be budged on this issue, even though I don't have a degree in the subject, I'm not an expert. And yet that's how we act when it comes to many political issues. We don't know the first thing about them. We don't know any of the bills that are currently being debated on the House floor or currently being debated in Senate committees. And yet we have this very hardened opinion. And we've completely brought up the drawbridge to bringing in any more information to become more learned on the subject. Before you have a hardened opinion, you actually have to know the relevant players, the relevant positions, the different motivations, and the sort of the cost-benefit analysis of different approaches. It's a very dispassionate view, and in some ways it's kind of dry. And that's, I think, one of the issues there. It's one of the problems, that it saps out the drama. And I think that's one of the reasons why that approach is not really the default that we take. We really have to exert effort in order to put ourselves into that frame of mind. And using this strategy described here, where we have to describe it ourselves, like, well, how does the economy work? How are gas prices set? If you put somebody back on their heels and they realize, I don't know the first thing about this, you start to kind of bring down and deflate that confidence. It makes it easier to have more of a curious mind as opposed to a very dogmatic, hard-headed approach to a topic.
That's right. And I think we wouldn't necessarily need to hold our politicians up as, just experts on every area of society. I think there's a mistake there that a lot of us make when we vote. It's as if, well, we've bought into what that candidate said. So by voting for them, we've validated their positions on everything. And I think that's a mistake also. We can keep in mind that not all politicians are expert in everything, and not all make wise judgments about everything across the board. Typically you'll have some things you agree with that Joe Biden has done and some things you disagree with. That's appropriate. You don't need to believe Biden is the best at everything or the worst at everything based on whether you happen to vote for him or not. And so I think that's an important step also, is we can always delay judgment. Like we can say, well, I don't understand healthcare well enough. I'm going to try my best to make a tentative judgment here, not knowing all the policy positions, all the backroom discussions, all the political theater. I'm going to just say what I know, and that's going to be good enough, and I'm going to try to learn, right? And I think that those are important things to keep in mind. You don't have to play for a team, and you don't have to back all the opinions as one whole ball of wax. You can be selective. You can always try to reserve judgment until you really feel like you have more of a handle on the facts.
It's a kind of unfortunate fact of our mind, but there might actually be a tension between advocacy for one's position and understanding the position. Because when you're an advocate, when you have closed your mind off willfully to other perspectives on an issue, then you're creating your own blind spots and you're doing nothing to dislodge them. But when there's a more open perspective and saying, well, I want to understand the issue from your point of view, not to say that I want to supplant and completely replace my perspective of the issue with your own. I just want to understand the way you're seeing it. And I think if this is one way to bring down one thing that might be pleasant to the person you're talking to is that curiosity. One thing we've talked about in previous episodes is to create that mutual curiosity. You do so by invoking surprise, right? Because one of the characteristics that the person you're talking to might not be hasty to ascribe to you is curiosity. They might see, well, you're just one of these nameless, faceless categories. You're a progressive, a conservative, a this or that, but they don't see you as an individual who's trying to learn about the world and is curious about their own story. And that's a way in which you can have a sort of mirroring of curiosity. It's not to say any of these tactics are deterministic. Again, we're not automatons, right? But it's a way to increase the probability. It's a way to sort of course correct in real time, because that's what we're trying to do here, is find alternatives. If we know that the approaches that we tend to take in our culture and our political culture don't seem to work very well, if anything, we become more trenchant, we become more divided, more polarized, then let's try a different approach, one that's actually built on trying to build those bridges instead of burning them.
That's right. And we do, in groups, we tend toward consensus. So this is one of those famous groupthink biases that was investigated in the 20th century in social psychology, that groups will tend toward a preferred opinion, and gradually dissent starts to be weeded out. And it's inconvenient to be the devil's advocate and the squeaky wheel and sort of upend the shared view, because groups will tend to sort of flock together in a way. And that's I think another thing to be aware of with the echo chamber effect. If you all started to no longer question core assumptions, or if you're not talking about the mechanisms of policy, you might be stuck in an echo chamber where you're kind of just piling on about how much you hate the other side and how correct your side is. There's not a lot to be gained there other than some shared, kinship. And we've talked about this before in a prior episode too, playing for the team. You can take that too far with echo chambers. And I think another good tip for avoiding the filter bubble phenomenon in news is to deliberately sample from across the news spectrum. So if you really want to throw your algorithm for a loop, check out MSNBC and then immediately go over to Breitbart. and then check out CNN and go right over to Fox News. And the only reason to do this would be just, they have slants and biases. Now you're just informing yourself about how different slant or different perspectives are being reflected in news sources. And you can certainly check out centrist news sources as well in that process. But doing so enables you to understand that there is not only one way to see any given policy phenomena, and remind yourself that other Americans are possibly getting a completely different perspective on especially heavily processed news or opinion news. Everyone can have an opinion, but we need to really be diversifying in order to try to get closer to reality.
Yeah, I think it's also one thing to keep in mind is, how is it that we're taking the information in? Okay, so it's one thing when the echo chamber consists purely of print. That's one thing. But when the echo chamber has some acoustic element to this, let's keep that in mind, that the more elements you're adding to the way in which information is being transmitted to us, if it's done so in a very confident, very charismatic, very fluent way, this all gets baked into the cocktail of how we're receiving that information. And we're all susceptible to that. Our brains have a difficult time separating competence and confidence. Those two things oftentimes overlap. The signal for someone being very knowledgeable about a subject is the fluency and eloquence with which they're transmitting the information. In fact, we can fall prey to this phenomenon as well if we're able to string together propositional knowledge about any number of perspectives on a complex issue. We can fool ourselves and I think we know a lot more about the topic than we do. I remember one very striking example that came to mind for me. I remember reading a debate about, or I was reading up on gas prices and why they've been fluctuating so much these last couple of years. And I was reading an article in The Economist, and I wasn't starting with the intention of trying to deflate my confidence and how much I understood the issue, but that really was one of the knock-on effects. About halfway through the article, I remember thinking, I'm completely out of my depth here. Like, I realized there's just so much basic information that needs to be understood on this issue. And yet so many of us walk around like we imagine we have this encyclopedic knowledge about the topic. So that's one strategy we can adopt for ourselves, even outside the context of a conversation with someone, is to go from the low resolution headline Twitter post way or meme way of receiving information to going all the way to the far end of the extreme of the most highly layered, most high resolution presentation of information. It's a very humbling experience. And in some ways, I think it's good for us to keep our confidence in check.
So one way I'm pretty sure gas prices definitely aren't set is by the president just saying, here's the gas price. Although at pumps, firsthand, I've seen a little sticker of Joe Biden that says, I did that, pointing to the price. I don't think that's good evidence or sound reporting. And I think there would be many oil multimillionaires if it was really easy to predict this. So another strategy you can take is, look at ExxonMobil's stock price and try to predict it. And if you can do it, put all your money in it.
Yes.
I don't think you'll be putting all your money in it.
Write a book on it too.
Yes, exactly.
You're one in a billion.
Any industry, any economic force has so many moving pieces. And those are even the pieces we understand, the variables we have a handle on. Some things are cyclical in different ways, but then there's so much just unforeseeable variance out in the world. So the world's complex, and I think that's a great example because it is a very polarizing issue. It's almost like whoever's in the White House or whoever's predominating in Congress at the moment is solely responsible for gas prices, because it's something that really hits people on a day-to-day basis. And one can easily begin getting cynical in that it's a force of evil that's pulling the wool over people's eyes. So the world is not going to offer that kind of fluency or that kind of certainty. So we should be more and more skeptical, I think, whenever that's on offer.
Yeah, and it's also elucidates some phenomenon that I remember first coming into this space just as a researcher. What I found interesting was the way content was packaged, especially say on podcast platforms, say like YouTube. A lot of political commentary shows, they're extremely acerbic. in their tone. It's very combative. It's very abusive towards the other side, very insulting of their moral integrity and their intelligence. Because when one embraces a narrative, events do not occur in a very neutral fashion, as in, oh, this event occurred. No, it is categorized in some specific way. For instance, if one has a certain politician to which one has sworn fealty in their mind, it's not just that, let's say, that politician is being persecuted and that there's evidence against them. It's, in my mind, my narrative is my politician, the person I'm supporting, is under attack. They're under assault. And any event that's an unwelcome event from the perspective of that politician winds up being confirmatory of that narrative. There's literally no adverse event that can happen to that politician that isn't typecast in my mind as, oh, this is another example of my narrative being confirmed. This is one of the dangers of being captured within a filter bubble, is that one ends up having a narrative that is just explains everything, and it's always true. In fact, that's considered the mark of pseudoscience, is it's an unfalsifiable theory, right? Where every event, an event to the contrary, like a dispositive event and a positive event, both those things wind up being confirmatory of the same claim, the same hypothesis. It's one of the pitfalls of echo chambers and filter bubbles that we hope to highlight, and we hope that we have highlighted in this episode.
And it's one of the pitfalls of dictatorships. The lack of a free press provides that sort of unified answer of presenting a certain side as being always the heroes, and the villains are painted a certain way, and there's no dissent. So the mark of a free press is to have a lack of fluency, a lack of congruence, and many, many perspectives on offer. Of course, some, much like the diet analogy, some of that is more nutritious than others, and so we have to keep that in mind. And I think we've really covered a lot of those challenges. I think some of those remedies, though, are just so important to keep in mind, to diversify one's news intake, reserve judgment, and when you talk to others, do more listening and seek to bond and explore together than trying to conquer and supplant or convert someone to your opinion. Because the world is so complex, and the polarized route is the simple route and the definitive route in which you're seeking a truth rather than grappling with the complexities of reality.
Yeah, I think that's the right note in which to strike for these issues that we're all going to have to contend with, and it'll become more and more predominant as we continue to engage more and more in an online medium in order to converse in politics, in order to gain information. It's important that we equip ourselves with these skills to whatever extent that is possible. And we are grateful to our audience for engaging this exploration of this topic. And if you're interested and have any comments or remarks to make, feel free to use the comment entry below, and subscribe to receive more interesting content and notifications on future episodes of Productive Politics.